Hello and welcome back to the Middling Along podcast. I'm your host, Emma Thomas, founder of Managing the Menopause and the Triple Shift. And joining me today is author and speaker, Dr Giselle Goodwin. Over the course of her 25-year career, she's co-founded, grown and successfully sold 3 businesses before returning to university to explore the elusive issue of women's work-life balance. In 2022, she completed her PhD on women, work and well-being, and her book, Can Women Really Have It All?, is the culmination of that research. Welcome to the podcast, Giselle.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
I'm delighted. So we should explain this slightly kind of manic tone of my voice. This is our third do-over of getting the recording to work. We've both had quite a 24 hours in sort of typical midlife style, managing lots of lifing. So yeah, very, very, very grateful to you for being here. And I think we decided that it's really important that we show up authentically and talk about when things are not going right.
When things are definitely not going right. I was just saying I was so relieved to read your LinkedIn post this morning because A, I was nervous about the podcast. B, I was thinking my brain fog is wicked. This is one of those days I'm struggling to string sentences together. And I've just had a crazy few weeks. So when I read your LinkedIn post and thought, yeah, okay, so I'm now being interviewed by somebody who also is juggling the same types of stuff I am. And yeah, has the same type of chaos going on at home. So I was saying to you, I've just moved house. And so it's absolutely bonkers. And you know, when your home environment is all in disarray, your head feels in disarray as well. So we moved house just before half term. We've then been away for half term with the kids. I've got back to boxes and boxes and boxes, but no wardrobes. And so yesterday morning involved, my cousin has come and he's fitting some wardrobes and stuff for us, but let himself into the house early yesterday morning. And as I came out of the shower, there he was in the bedroom, ready to install wardrobes. And the day didn't get better yesterday. Like it just didn't. The amount of I don't know, stuff being thrown at me was quite intense. So I have arrived this morning, yes, in a less than Zen-like place to discuss women's
which is
happiness,
perfectly,
all the rest of it.
Perfectly played.
I'm feeling like, I could do with some of that myself.
Yeah, let's get into some of that good stuff, and
okay.
and how we can kind of survive the what I call it, the whack-a-mole of, you know, literally like the little things keep popping up and you keep hitting them with hammers and you think you're winning, and then another 7.
That juggle, that crazy number of plate spinners that we do.
So I've read your book because I make sure that I always read the books, my podcast guests. So I have a big stack behind me of books waiting to be read. But early on in the book, you include a quote from a writer called Courtney Martin, who says, "We're the daughters of feminists who said, you can be anything. And we heard you have to be everything." And I think that will strike a chord with lots of people listening. Certainly did for me, oldest of 3 daughters here. Why do you think so many of us feel this way?
Oh, I think, that quote is so resonant, isn't it? I think so many of us relate to that feeling. I think it's a culture that we're living in currently. I think particularly for midlife women, Gen X women, I think where we come to this is quite a unique place. So in terms of how we grew up and the cultural messaging we received growing up, about what was possible for women and what our role in society was and what was expected of us, was a lot, or certainly has shaped, I think, our opinions and that pressure that we feel to be all things to all people all the time. So I think certainly, you know, I grew up in the 70s and the 80s, and the messaging, and my accent is Canadian. So I grew up in Canada, but I've lived most of my adult life in the UK. And that messaging, very similar in much of the global north. The politics of the era was like Thatcher, Reagan. It was a real individualistic culture. So this idea that, you know, you need to put your big girl knickers on, get in the world of work, make your own way in the world. You were not to rely on a man to provide financially for you. You could do that yourself. So very much cultural messaging we all grew up with, I think, was that feminism was now kind of a done deal. They made those arguments, they won that fight, and now women could, and this is what I discuss in the book, can women really have it all? This idea of having it all in terms of balancing work and family, that I thought growing up was perfectly feasible, that women could do that in the same way, mothers could do that in the same way that fathers could. Having a career and having a family was absolutely okay. And I think what certainly hit me around the head, and I think happens to a lot of women, particularly when we get to midlife as well, and realize just the amount of stuff that we're juggling, is that all those responsibilities feel immense. So the cultural expectation now is that we will do both. So it's not necessarily just about simple choice that you choose to stay home or you choose to go to work. If you look at surveys, so there's some research done by the I think it's called the British Social Attitudes Survey, and they follow British attitudes over time to various sociological constructs. And they say that 50 years ago, if you asked people whether they thought that the woman's job was to stay home and look after the home and family, and a man's job was to go out and provide financially for his children, people, 50% of the population, would agree that that was the case. When they repeated that survey in 2017, only 7% thought that was the case. So we now see what researchers call this new sexual contract for women, where women are societally mandated not only to, fulfill our reproductive destinies by becoming mothers, which society has always expected of us, but also to provide financially for our children. So there's
And
definitely
look fabulous while we're doing it.
expectation there. And my argument, thank you so much, is exactly that, is that not only do women now have what they call this second shift inside the home and outside the home, I argue in my book that we have a third job. And as you say, I call it the work of living in a female body. And I divide it into 4 categories. So one of them is beauty, right? So exactly as you say, we need to look fabulous while doing that. The other is biology, just dealing with the pure biology of living in a female body and all that entails. And then safety and sex. So I kind of say there's this work and pressure that women have, not only from work inside the home, outside the home, but the work of living in a female body. And it's compounded by Instagram culture, and anything that we look at now, we can find somebody who is doing something better than us. So it's really easy in this day and age, and researchers call this the cost of comparison, that we spend so much time looking over our shoulders thinking, well, even if we did well at work, actually we've let the kids down. Or even if we did, a beautiful gardening project, the house looks a tip. There's lots of pressure in so many different domains, and it's so easy to look over your shoulder and think, well, I'm not fit, or I've not done the kids a homemade meal, or I've not done.
Yeah.
There's so much stuff.
There's always something to fail at. Even if
Always,
you're nailing it over here.
always, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And how, in the book, how do you sort of tackle that evolution of sort of those societal attitudes towards gender roles? How has that kind of evolved, and what are the kind of the biggest hurdles still for us to kind of get over as you see it?
Yeah, so this is really interesting. I mean, we could talk about this forever, couldn't we? In terms of there's so many things. We've come so far though. So I like to think about it in a hopeful way. Maybe that's me just trying to be optimistic, but I feel like we have to kind of keep pushing forward, and we have to realize how far we've come. Like, we've come so far in such a short space of evolutionary time. So if we look at it 100 years ago, women, we've tripled the number of women in the workforce in the last 100 years. So that's it's a massive change in terms of women's livelihoods and how we organize our lives and what we do. So, there's 3 times the number of women in the workforce than there was 100 years ago. So it's 76% of women work outside the home compared with 92% of men nowadays. So that's a big chunk of women. And if we think 100 years ago, it was 1928 when women got the vote on the same terms as men. It was the 1940s were a big deal in terms of the wars in the earlier part of the century, and what that did for women's kind of propulsion into the workforce. And then realizing, not only can we do these jobs, jobs that were typically reserved for men, so mechanics or engineers or truck drivers and things. But we quite like doing these jobs, and we're quite good at them, and we quite like the money. So women got a taste of more entry into the workforce in that period of time. And then we, of course, had a big recession in the 70s, and that also propelled women into the workforce too. So we've had a massive change in terms of where we've come from versus where we are, but we're still not there yet in terms of equity. And I think that's really important. So a big thing for me is around financial equity. And we know there's still a gender pay gap. So, we got the
Yeah.
1970 was the equal pay vote. And 1975, women were allowed to apply for mortgages and credit cards in their own names. But the gender pay gap is still there. It's narrowing. So I think that's really hopeful. But we've got a 20% gender investment gap and a 38% pension gap. And that's so significant for women in midlife. We are seeing the other side, and we're thinking about perhaps time that we took out with children when they were younger. And we're looking into retirement and thinking we have a significantly less retirement pot. And it affects women's
It's a
lives.
huge issue. Yeah.
It's an enormous issue. As the OECD says, it reduces women's quality of life. So financial inequity is a big thing. And in order to progress that, yeah, I guess we need to think about how far we've come, but we still have quite a way to go. So financial stuff is one thing, and women in the workforce. And then in terms of the other thing, when we think about, I guess, how far we've come in the last 100 years, women's bodily autonomy, I just think is such a massive thing. It's such a massive deal for how we're able to control our lives, what choices, what decisions we're able to make. And the 1960s was a massive revolution in that as well. So the advent of the contraceptive pill was just seismic. This idea that women, for the first time in history, had significant control in big numbers over when and how to plan pregnancies really changed the landscape for women. And I love the story of Margaret Sanger, who, she was a nurse living in New York in the earlier part of, in the 1900s. And she saw firsthand, she saw her mum die at age 49, having had 18 pregnancies and 11 live
I was
births.
astounded when I read that, but I guess it wasn't that unusual. But
No,
just to think of what
no.
your body would go
Your
through.
body goes through. I mean, your body goes through. I speak to friends who have 3 children. I have 2, and they say, the third one did my back in or did whatever. And you think about the pressure childbearing puts on your body. And so to go through that in life and to not have any control over how many children and how that works, and not have the education either. So Margaret was, she was absolutely instrumental. She can be a bit of a controversial figure, but she was absolutely instrumental in terms of promulgating the information to women around how they would protect themselves in terms of condoms and diaphragms and things at that time. And so she started disseminating information, but she got shut down. So at the time in New York, I think this is around 1918, there were federal anti-obscenity laws. And so talking about sex in public was just not the done thing. And she basically was arrested for giving people contraceptive advice. And she was put in a workhouse. And the judge who arrested her said, women do not have the right to copulate with the feeling of security that there will be no resulting conception. So this idea was that, there was a control around women's sexuality. And actually, yes, we want you to have babies, but actually we don't want you to go around having sex willy-nilly. And so women had limited education and access to contraception. And that was enormous. That pretty much ruled and dictated what your life chances and outcomes were. So I think control of women's bodies is enormous. And I think there's so many other stats around that as well in terms of how things have changed recently, just in terms of laws that have come into force in much more recent history than you possibly would have thought. So, for instance, rape within marriage only became illegal in 1991. Laws around coercive control was 2015. We know things such as abortion rights in America being rolled back in 2022. And if we look at other parts of the world, what's going on in Afghanistan in terms of women not being able to speak in public and be veiled. And in terms of, I think in Iraq, they've just reduced the age of consent to 9 years old. So they've effectively made child marriage perfectly legal
Mm,
from age 9 in Iraq. So these things, in terms of how women's lives look in the whole world, we've come a long way, but I think it's still really, really important. So if you're kind of saying to me, what do I think the big kind of things are? I think there's financial equity in women's work, which is a very much global north problem. And then there's control of women's bodies, which I think is a really still a big issue in many parts of the world today, including our own. We're,
yeah,
we're, we're
it
seeing
feels
things.
precarious, doesn't it?
It
as
does,
if
yeah.
these kind of hard won things could be so easily rolled
Taken
back.
back. Hmm.
Yeah, and in terms of sort of workplaces specifically, what kind of things do you think would most effectively support kind of mothers who are working outside of the home, but also kind of those of us who are carers or have those kind of dual roles, and sort of yeah, really just supporting us to be able to show up in workplaces in the way that we want to.
Because it's key, isn't it? I think caregiving is still very much a woman's role in society. Caregiving,
Mm,
as we say, for elderly parents, for children, being neighborly, being pleasant, being agreeable, those are still very, yeah, female focused traits in society. And it's not valued in the way that it should be. It's not given the credit that it should. And so there's discourse we can have and cultural things we can do. But also, I think, there's three big campaigns in terms of supporting women in the workplace. And the three biggies are flexible work, childcare, and good paid parental leave. And I think we know, when we look at societies which have supported these better, we know those societies are much happier. So that's what my book goes into. It talks about what we call the female happiness paradox, which is this idea that women today are less happy than they were 50 years ago, both absolutely and in comparison with men. And we talk about, why that is, why, even though we have, as we've said, more control over our fertility, more control over our finances than we've ever had, why is it that we're feeling overwhelmed, under pressure, burnt out? So, we know that working mothers have up to 40% more stress than women without children, and they're 28% more likely to burn out than working fathers. So there's an awful lot of, I guess, non-recognition of the importance of child giving or childcare, sorry. And then
mhm.
there's also this pressure and things that we're under. And so the three biggies, as I say, I think are flexible working, paid parental leave, and subsidized childcare. And we would see, as we know in the countries where they do this better than we do here, those countries have not only greater gender equality, but greater well-being as well. So there's something we call the World Happiness Index, and they measure this now annually, which countries in the world have the greatest well-being. And the greatest well-being is for both women and men is in those countries that have greater gender equality. So it's a win-win. It's not kind of a zero-sum game. It's a
Mm.
win-win getting to 50-50.
And you talk, I think the statistic that you quote in the book is about, is it kind of working, 85% of working mothers experiencing feelings of guilt. And I was like, oh,
Mm.
that's low. I thought it would be higher. So how can we better kind of navigate, what you've talked about, these sort of expectations and that turning that inward, that
Mm.
internalized guilt versus those societal expectations, and kind of prioritizing ourselves and our well-being.
Yeah, it's so important, isn't it? Yeah, and I'm 100% the I'm definitely in the 85% category. And it comes out of nowhere, doesn't it? Or it seems to come out of nowhere, this feeling of, yeah, can't do right for doing wrong and never really quite delivering for anybody because there's so much on your plate.
Mm.
I suppose it's helpful to know that we're not alone with that. I talk a lot about delegation is a really big thing. I think sometimes, well, sometimes it's true, but sometimes I think it's nice to be needed. And sometimes I notice this for myself. It's my ego that thinks, wow, if I don't do this, the world will stop turning. And nothing will get done. It won't get done properly. And I've learned as I get older to delegate more. I have to say, I'm still not brilliant at it, but delegation is really key. Actually stepping back. And I heard something recently, which I thought was just great, which was this saying, which is feel the guilt and do it anyway. So that book, don't you? Feel the fear and do it anyway. And they've transmuted it into feel the guilt and do it anyway. So
Yeah.
as a mother who sometimes feels like you're putting everybody else's needs above your own, actually, if you take some time for yourself, and you might feel guilty about it, but you have to realize how important that is. How
Yeah, got to
important it
kind of
is to
push through that the guilt barrier, let's call it, and
the guilt barrier and sharpen your own soul. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, and it is, we talk about that sort of, putting your own oxygen mask on first,
Mm-hmm.
but it is so true, like if you're that kind of linchpin and you go down, the whole ship goes
The
down with
whole
you.
ship falls, doesn't it? It does. But then actually, there's always, it's like leaving a job. I always remember an old boss of mine saying that, you're actually doing something very effectively if you've taught everybody in your team how to manage on their own without you. If you're the person around which everybody else is spinning, something's wrong with how you're organizing it. Actually, you need everybody else in that team to be able to hold that up without you. That's the ultimate key, isn't it? Quite
Yeah,
hard to
and
do
that's
sometimes.
definitely something where I see, I kind of probably need to, talking about your delegation, right? I need my kids they're old enough now to be picking up more stuff at home, and that's going to kind of relieve a bit of the sort of the stress for me. So
And they
sometimes,
can
yeah,
do that,
yeah,
midlife, they're teenagers. And I think I'm definitely guilty of this. I don't give them enough responsibility because I think, well, they're stressed, or they've got exams, or they've got this, or it'd be nice if I did X, Y, Z. And actually, they're perfectly capable of putting their own laundry on and doing the dishes and whatever. And actually, sometimes it's doing them a disservice not to give them that responsibility, because that's just lifing and adulting, isn't it?
yeah, and they need training up, ready to be
Training.
launched. Another lovely quote from your book. You say many women naturally break up with their good girl persona in midlife as years of being taken for granted in their households and menopause rage come to a head. So, what are your other than what we've already talked about, what are your tips for kind of breaking up with that good girl persona with the least possible fallout?
Yeah, Emma, I am still working on this.
Aren't we all?
This is a situation for me. And I think, like, I've really, I've spent time trying to kind of figure out why that's so ingrained. And I think for me, it comes from quite a deep seated place of security and safety. And I think, or I know, that people pleasing is gendered, and
Mm,
that it is women who exhibit this behavior more so than men, that good girl people pleasing behavior. And quite a lot of it for many women is rooted in this need for safety and security. And actually, if I'm kind to those around me, sometimes, particularly if people are physically bigger than you, it's the safest option, isn't it? And also, it's kind of a way of maybe making friends and not, and getting back up as well. So I think for a lot of people, it's a really hard thing to let go of. And one of the ways I try and frame it is, so the way I try to think about it now, as I'm, a recovering people pleaser, is to think that actually, if I'm not myself and truthful with people about who I am, what I can kind of contribute, what I'm happy to do, what I'm not happy to do, if I always pay lip service to stuff, people are clever. They're going to figure you out. They're going to know you don't really mean it. And the one thing I don't want to be is disingenuous.
mm,
I don't want people to think, well, I can't really trust or rely on what she says because she doesn't really mean it. So that helps me frame some of this people pleasing behavior in, actually, if I'm truthful with people, they will see me as trustworthy. And that is more important to me than being seen as nice. I want to be trusted more than I want to be just kind of nice, even if I don't really mean it. I think that's quite disingenuous. So I try and frame it like that.
mm.
The other thing, and I talk about this in the book as well, I try and do is just practicing, and it does take practice, sitting with the guilt of saying no rather than that slow burn resentment of too many yeses.
Yeah.
And it's taken me a long time to learn that, because it's easier just to say yes in the moment and think the resentment will build. And you have to have so much experience. You probably have to get to midlife before you go, what? To be able to say, no, this doesn't work. In the long term, it's not the answer to just keep putting my needs last and not being clear about what I'm okay with and not okay with. And so just sitting with that idea that this guilt that I'm feeling that's acute, which I don't like, is much better than the ultimate fallout, which is that slow burn of the resentment that goes on for longer. So I try and kind of reframe it. Takes practice though. Can't say I'm
Definitely. I
fully
think
there
we're all
yet.
lots of us on that same journey. And yeah, and not to say that we should, be telling everyone to F off with their requests for, bake sale
Their
goodies
demands.
or to help out. But yeah, it's figuring out the right kind of balance of boundaries and what we're prepared to take on or what we have capacity to take on, because at the end of the day we're doing nobody any favors by keep piling more and more and more onto this kind of ginormous plate of things
Yeah,
that we're holding.
for sure.
Talked a little briefly around the edges about giving our kids more responsibilities, but how can we kind of best engage men and boys in creating that more equitable society? There's a lot talked about around at the moment about kind of the manosphere and how we're kind of, we're failing boys in this sort of whole kind of conversation. But how do you see us kind of bringing them in and to this whole balancing act?
Okay, it's so important, isn't it? It's so important, because if we have conversations like that, it's one thing you and I speaking to each other and speaking to like-minded individuals, but unless we actually put ourselves out of our comfort zone and speak to those with different opinions or different life experiences and really try to not only engage in conversation but genuinely listen, because isn't that, well, what all of us want is just to be seen and understood. Unless we have more of those conversations, we're not going to get anywhere. We're just going to all sit in our own little silos, talking
Mm.
to each other and agreeing with each other. So we need to be prepared to have more difficult conversations. And I think it's tough. Like, I don't think it's easy. I had a conversation with a guy a few weeks ago on holiday, which was just quite illuminating. It was really interesting for me. So we were away on holiday. I was with a bunch of other couples. I didn't necessarily know the other couples. I knew some of them well, some of them not. And one of the guys, a kind of really successful, confident guy, was pushing back at me quite a lot about my book and saying, well, it's gone too far nowadays. All the guys I know are saying it's gone far too far. This is, enough is enough type of thing. And we had a really kind of just interesting open conversation about, we both listened to a Stephen Bartlett podcast. I don't know if you've heard it. It was a few weeks ago with Scott Galloway. And Scott was positioning this idea that, men have lost their way. And I think this is true. I think, both men and women have lost their way. Gender roles have changed for everyone. So there's lots of people saying, well, who am I? What am I? Where do I fit? I'm not sure how it works. And Scott's answer to this was to say, my prescription for masculinity is that men's roles are the three P's. It's protector, provider, procreator, and that's what men need to be. And he spoke really really well about, and very understandably about this idea of, men taking responsibility and stepping up and all these types of things. And I could really relate to what he said and how he said it, and how the idea that, you have this construct which is like a framework. I can imagine why that feels quite safe and grounding. That's what you need to do. And I get why that appeals. But then equally, the conversation we had was, I was saying, what about the people who don't feel they necessarily fit into a neat box about what this should look like? And that doesn't make them feel
Mm.
safe. That makes them feel unseen and not valued and whatever. And we talked about this idea of maybe how you could expand the provider protector construct. And I was saying, when I think of protector, for instance, I kind of think about it in terms of expanding the definitions a little bit. So, like when I think about protector, I don't necessarily think, protect me from, I don't know, bears in the woods. That was the meme going around the internet recently, wasn't it? I think about protector as my my dad when I was a little girl and me having an asthma attack in the middle of the night and lying in bed and not being able to breathe. And him and my mum stood outside my bedroom door going, will we take her to the hospital? What should we do? And then inevitably deciding we better go. And my dad lifting me gently out of bed, carrying me to the car, driving me to the hospital, sitting next to my bed while they gave me a nebulizer, holding my hand, really patient,
Mm.
really gentle, very protective, and made me feel safe. So I was saying, that caregiving element to the protector construct, I think, if we expand those definitions, and then I was saying about provider as well, yes, I get that, you want to take responsibility, but for me, provider is not about people making money. For me, provider is like showing up, like getting shit done, like taking responsibility for stuff. So like one of the things that attracted me to my husband was this idea that he knew how to keep houseplants alive, you know? So that's it's I just
Yeah.
think that we need to have conversations. We need to maybe expand these definitions, and we need to really think about, where other people are coming from. And if we sit in our own silos and don't have the conversations, all we end up with is like, people speaking, to an echo chamber, which doesn't get us
Mm.
anywhere.
I think, as you were sort of saying all of that, it reminded me of, I don't know if you have come across Gabrielle Blair. She was on the podcast a while back, and I think there's she wrote this whole sort of imaginary dialogue between, man and God, this sort of idea of like, I need you to be, I need you to show up for your family. And the guy is like, yeah, I'm ready to, fight the kind of the intruders and do all the things and the manly things. And God's like, well, actually I was thinking more along the lines of, laundry and, making sure your kid gets to, to
School
the
on
medical
time.
appointments and making sure they've got the shoes that fit. And the guy was like, oh, no, I was thinking more along the lines of, the manly kind of, ruggedy. And God's like,
Yes.
so yeah, so actually you're not prepared to do anything for your family, are you? You're kind of you want to fit into this rigid kind of construct of what it
Chopping
means
down
to.
trees. Yeah.
Yeah, anyway, and
Yeah.
it goes on at great length. It's a great, I'll try and find it and link it in the show notes, because I think it kind of speaks very eloquently to this whole idea of, what is a man, what is a kind of a father, a husband,
Mm.
a kind of, yeah, just sort of trying to redefine all of that. Let's close out, because I know you've got this, you've kind of developed a framework in the book about sort of practical
Mm.
things that kind of women can do to improve, mental health, boundaries, and overall happiness. So that maybe just sort of touching on a few of that. Don't want to kind of give away all the secrets of your book, because obviously I want people to go away and read it. But can you talk a little bit about how you kind of, a few of those, and how you kind of pulled all of your sort of findings together into that framework?
Yeah, of course I can. Yeah. Yeah. So yes, the book investigates in general what happiness is and the science of happiness, why it's different in certain places for men versus women, what it looks like, how we get more of it. So this idea that actually it's not just fixed. Some of happiness is genetic. We're genetically predisposed to be a bit more Tigger or Eeyore. But quite a substantial amount of well-being is related to behaviors. So if you implement these behaviors in your life, you will be happier. And I go through, I've got like a little mnemonic for it. It's called Empower Life. And so there's lots of different things I talk through in detail there. So things like expect less from yourself, expect more from others, setting boundaries, delegating, setting goals, finding your tribe, focusing on yourself, um, being more of yourself. And I suppose if there was one thing I was to leave your listeners with today, it would be this idea of just being more you. And actually, and I think midlife is such an opportunity
Mm.
for reassessing, for regrowth, for reinvention, and actually knowing ourselves better. And as I say this as a mother of teenagers, like you don't know what you want when you're a teenager. You barely know what you want in your 20s. Your 30s are a blur. By the time you get to kind of your 50s, you know a lot more about yourself. And I think you have a better understanding of what works for you, what doesn't, and what you want that next chapter, the next part of your life to look like. And so, if there was any kind of takeaway today, I would just say, write down a little list of what energizes you and what depletes you. And at least know what that is, because that's your starter for 10.
Love that.
And then the other thing is, if you want to go on my website, gisellegoodwin.com, I have a free, like a happiness manifesto that you can download. And it's a little quiz. Again, that's just a little starter for 10, where you can kind of have a look at where I am in terms of my own well-being and possibly where I want to get to, and what are some of these behaviors that I could maybe implement in my own life, what would work. But yeah, if there's one thing you would take away, it would be the be more you, and actually be intentional. Think about it and write down what energizes me, what depletes me, and yeah, start heading in those directions.
Yeah. And being honest as well, because I've talked a little bit about this before, about the sort of, we are, comes back to that sort of people pleasing and that sort of putting everyone else ahead of us. It's like, start, it's not easy always to vocalize, even if you can identify the things that you want and you want more of. It's hard sometimes to kind of to claim that out loud and to vocalize that and to say, this is what I want for me. And, that might mean other people making some compromises or having a bit less of my time, or, I'm going to have to change some things around. And, that's maybe going to be difficult for some of the people in my life. So it's not saying that any of that stuff is easy, but it's very, very worth it.
So hard. It's so hard, isn't it? It's very, very difficult to ask, well, to understand what you need. That's the first thing. Do you even know what you need? Or have you been so busy putting everybody else's needs first that you don't even know what it is you need or you want? So understanding it, but exactly as you say, it's one thing to understand it. It's another whole kettle of fish to articulate and verbalize that and put that out there and be really clear and specific with your loved ones, particularly as so many women in midlife realize they've spent so many years in dynamics where they're the primary caregiver, and to then go, but I need something now. I have needs and this is what they are. So hard to articulate that, but it's necessary.
Well, great place to finish up. We'll put a link to Giselle's website in the show notes. Go take the happiness quiz, find out what your next steps to claiming that more fulfillment without wanting to sound too kind of woo-woo about it. But yeah, you're worth it. Invest some time in thinking about some of this stuff. And where else can people find you, Giselle, online?
So yeah, gisellegoodwin.com is my website. You can find me on Instagram at Giselle Goodwin Writes, same on YouTube, or LinkedIn. I do quite a lot there under Dr Giselle Goodwin.
Fantastic. And we'll obviously put a link in to buy a copy of the book as well. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for bearing with me with the inevitable technology and lifing spiciness.
Lifing spiciness. I'm in.
And have a wonderful day. Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
And you, likewise. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the Middling Along podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please go and leave us a review over at Apple Podcasts. You can check out the full back catalogue of all our episodes over at midlingalong.com. You can also find out more about my work as a coach. Go to www.thetripleshift.org.